Welcome to the Security DNA podcast, powered by SecurityInfoWatch. This is your front line for bold insights and real intelligence that cuts through the noise and gets straight to what matters most. I'm Samantha Schober, assistant editor of SecurityInfoWatch and the producer of today's episode. At SecurityInfoWatch, we deliver sharp, real-time insights into the biggest challenges facing security and risk professionals today. From emerging threats to game-changing technologies, we go beyond the headlines to provide expert analysis, real-world strategies, and critical risk intelligence, giving you the knowledge you need to stay ahead in this rapidly evolving landscape. My colleague, Steve Lasky, a seasoned security industry veteran with over 35 years of experience, will join us today. As the editorial director for the security group at Endeavor Business Media, Steve brings deep expertise and a unique perspective to every conversation. Today we have a couple of compelling guests as Steve sits down with Chuck Randolph and Trinity Davis of 360 Privacy. So let's get started. Chuck Randolph is Senior Vice President for Strategic Intelligence and Security at 360 Privacy, bringing over 30 years of experience in corporate, intelligence, and military operations. In the private sector, Chuck previously served in executive roles at Microsoft, Ontic, and At Risk International, spearheading global risk management, executive protection, and intelligence strategies. He specializes in converging cyber and physical security to enhance organizational resilience. A retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel, Chuck earned recognition for valor during combat operations in Afghanistan and led pioneering information operations initiatives throughout his military career. Chuck is deeply engaged in advancing the security profession, serving as co-founder and past president of the International Protective Security Board, chairman emeritus of the Corporate Executive Protection Leadership Council, former board member of the Association of International Risk Intelligence Professionals, and chair of the Sam Houston State University's Critical Infrastructure Research Forum. Now, Trinity Davis has been involved with the executive protection industry for more than 18 years, during which he has expertly cultivated and guided cross-functional teams. His firm commitment has been pivotal in safeguarding the security and privacy of executives and their families across diverse sectors, including private industry, social media, fintech, and private family office space. Through his exceptional leadership, he has consistently ensured the highest standards of safety and confidentiality, earning the trust of those he has been charged with protecting as well as his peers. And with that, let's turn it over to Steve.
All right, gentlemen. Great to have you here, both Trinity and Chuck.
Thanks, Steve. I don't know, man. After that intro, I think we're good. Remarks complete. Everybody have a great week.
I tell you what. Well, it's got everybody salivating for what you guys are going to say. That's all. It's been an interesting week, anyways. I mean, we had things we were going to talk about because it's been for the last 2 months we've seen a lot of high-profile shootings targeting both CEOs and elected officials, and those have sent shockwaves through the corporate boardrooms and state houses alike. In December of 2024, we saw United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson gunned down on a Manhattan sidewalk. Mm-hmm. And this event prompted corporations like United Health, J&J, and Eli Lilly to invest millions in their executive protection measures, which sometimes just get neglected. And then just several weeks ago, on June 14th, we had a gunman impersonating a police officer break into the homes of Minnesota lawmakers and fatally shoot former House Speaker Melissa Hortman and wound Senator John Hoffman and his wife. This guy had a manifesto and a hit list targeting as many as 70 politicians, underscoring the political motives behind his act. So these acts are really forcing a reckoning on what was once an almost unthinkable an event in our country. Leaders, whether in business or public service, really are no longer safe in public spaces, or they can't assume they're safe in public spaces. And executive protection is in the spotlight now like it's never been in the spotlight.
Yeah.
So, right now we're considering what does it take to assess an executive's risk profile, how do personal, political, and ideological threats converge, and as visibility and accessibility increase, how can organizations strike a balance between openness and robust security? So we're going to try to talk about some of these things this afternoon here on the podcast. 360, you guys are a leader in digital executive protection solutions. You've got a unique way that you approach the business, because you take both the cybersecurity and physical security, and bring both data inputs from both of those worlds together to create a profile to protect a client. So as we look at this, executive protection has shifted from just reactive bodyguarding to proactive intelligence-led, integrated digital, physical, and reputational risk mitigation practices. Let's talk a little bit about, from your end and just across the industry, how executive protection has evolved from early incidents and then straight into what's going on today. Chuck, I'll let you start, and Trinity, go ahead and jump in afterwards.
Yeah, that's a mouthful, but it's a great question. I mean, since I got in the EP saddle over 30 years ago, things, we had a time, Steve, where, you get your piece of paper, it was folded, you put it in your suit pocket, you pulled it out, you knew what the agenda was. You kind of had some threat briefing that came from somebody somewhere else. You didn't really know what it was, and you had your earpiece and you're off and going. It's Trinity and I, we're protecting you. And it's just kind of what they used to say, like one or two riots and one or two Rangers, and here we go. We received information from somebody or somewhere, and now I think over time we're at a point now where we're getting and receiving and managing and analyzing intelligence in the moment as much as the old times when we would get these briefings. So as I think about maybe some of the biggest trends we've seen is the ability of, and this idea we call protective intelligence, to kind of look at all things like threat-informed, intelligence-driven, operations-led. We understand the environment we're in. We're receiving telemetry that's actionable, that makes it intelligence, whether it's from our teammates, whether it's from open source on our own supercomputer in our hand known as a smartphone, or whether that's if we're fortunate enough to have a team of folks in the background that's feeding it to us. And we're making fluid and agile decisions, and we're enabling fluid and agile decisions in the moment to keep our protectees safe. Now, Trinity, I'll purposely kick it over to you in terms of that digital footprint and that digital executive protection space, because as much as I have high net worth and corporate, we're kind of flip sides of the same coin, where you have a lot of high net worth and some corporate.
Yeah, that's correct. So I think one of the things that you really hit on is driven by intelligence. And two things that I specifically was looking for before I spin off and talk about the digital space is both tactical intelligence and strategic intelligence. Like, I need somebody to tell me to turn left now because of something that's happening down the road. And I also need somebody to look at big picture, geopolitics, the shape of the organization, sentiment analysis, etc. So I think you're spot on, Chuck. It has to be intelligence driven. When it comes to the digital footprint of executives, I was actually a client across two different organizations, an ultra high net worth family office, and then also a fintech company when I was first introduced to 360 privacy. And I actually employed this team to help secure the digital footprints of both of those clients because of the prevalence of a bad actor simply being able to Google where someone lives or what their phone number is or what their email address is. And I think the unfortunate reality is that we kind of live in an interconnected world where every relationship or every transaction that we have, we are a product of that transaction. We are freely giving up our data through the course of all of those interactions. And I'll give you a prime example of such. Let's just say you and I go out to have a networking dinner, and we give up our phone number to the host or hostess so they can text us when our table is ready, Steve. That phone number and my name are going into a database, and part of the transaction between the restaurant and the software platform is they get to actually maintain the data, and it's become a secondary revenue stream for almost every facet of industry. So we are being sold off as a commodity, and that's not impacting just the high net worth folks, the rich, the famous. That's impacting us all. And all of that to be said, that it doesn't take a sophisticated actor. It doesn't take, anonymous. It doesn't take, a nation state actor to have special access and understanding of the dark web to gain our data points, right? It's simply done through OSINT tools off of a Google search or a Bing search or a Yahoo search to be able to get access to all that information in a matter of moments. And the unfortunate reality is it's not just this keyboard. To Chuck's point, there's more computing power in the palm of our hands than NASA had to put man on the moon.
Right.
Steve, there's a great book. We have a colleague who, and Trinity and I have both read this book called, and we get nothing from this, by the way, but there's a great book for your bookshelf by a gentleman named Byron Tao, and he wrote a book called Means of Control that really kind of talks about the rise post 9/11, and let's pin that for a second, post 9/11 of data brokers, information brokers, and things. I remember back in 95, 96, 97, when I first met Cynthia Hetherington talking about this idea of PII, how we're trackable through information then. And then you look at means of control, and it talks about what happened in 9/11, and then how there was tracking done on the terrorists that committed that terrible act. And then how the pivot from that realized, like, oh, we can monetize this into something much greater. I mean, it's a great book. I'm doing a terrible job of summarizing in 20 seconds, but it's something I think anyone in the industry should really pick up and read and ask themselves, how do I fit in this? To Trinity's point, as an individual, where does my principle fit in? And also, how does my organization fit into all this? Because, some of it we're not, information's like weeds, Steve. It comes up in the garden.
Sure.
Trinity and I go out and we weed the garden, high five, and say, we're great. And you say, thanks, fellas. And in 2 weeks, half the weeds are back.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about how has the nature of executive and political threats evolved over recent years here? I mean, we've got, a polarized political country. We've got now with events in the Middle East and Iran, we're looking at possible terror cells popping up and going after high-profile individuals in the country. So, what are the new risk factors that we need to be considered when assessing the vulnerability of high-profile individuals?
So Trinity and I know, Trinity, I probably talk to you 5 or 6 times a week at the least. And we were talking, last week, because as we record this, of course, there's been activity in Iran. So things are, going to be heating up in the Straits of Hormuz. Also, if you're someone who follows the cyber stuff, that's something also that's probably going to be heating up. And there's people that can speak far deeper to what the implications and geostrategic stuff of that is. But Trinity, I immediately had a call over the weekend and said, how do we think about this? There's this idea of priorities and requirements. We've seen, I think, Steve, you said it succinctly, in the last, 6 or 7 months, we've seen a then candidate, now president, have 2 attempted assassinations. We've seen the murder of a CEO, after the Trump attempted assassinations, a lot of organizations said, oh my gosh, this happened in an event. Could it happen to us? December hits, the universe answers and says it absolutely can happen to you. You're now part of the conversation. And then, a couple of weeks ago, we see this individual, Bolter in Minnesota, murder and attempted assassination on legislators. I mean, it really, and then now Iran. So we have this idea of priorities and requirements. These things that are requirements in the morning soon become monitoring priorities because there's another requirement we have to do. I think for us as protectors, we have to step back and always ask, so what to our organization? So I'm a retired lieutenant colonel, as Samantha, succinctly put at the beginning here, and appreciate that intro, Samantha. And I used to look at things as lieutenant colonel or officer or major or captain or Lieutenant Randolph. And then, I spent many years at Microsoft. I look at things as Microsoft, and there's things I look at Citizen. I think as a protector, we need to step back and we need to always ask, I may feel this way personally or some other professional affiliation I have, but what is the effects to my organization? What does my organization stand for? What is as Tony Robbins might say, what is the hallucination of the organization out there? where do our folks fit within that? And then step back and say, where are our centers of gravity within these individuals, and how should we start looking at them? I mean, Trinity, I've heard you say many times, like, a great protector is an inquisitive one who just looks at the threat and then says, and then goes around and asks questions. How do we prevent, or what would we do? I mean, what would you add to this?
I got to tell you, like, you covered it really well. I don't know that there's anything that I can add to that other than the fact that, Steve, I think specifically some of the issues that we're seeing here in the U.S. right now are not new, unfortunately. I think that in 2008, when the Occupy Wall Street movement really began, and we saw kind of the eat the rich spin out of that. I dealt with that in Silicon Valley for a number of years, and it's kind of more from just eat the rich, high net worth, ultra high net worth families, to corporations, to anti-CEO sentiment. I don't think this is going away. I think, by and large, the gap between the haves and have-nots has spread, more so through COVID. Unfortunately, you've seen billionaires expand their wealth by 100, 200% in some cases. So the sentiment is not going away, and unfortunately, that ideological move is really helping when you start to see some of these unfortunate instances happen. And I'll give you a prime example. I think it's like $650,000, if I'm not mistaken, currently is in Maggioni's defense fund. I think that's pretty telling for the average American to donate $1, $5, $10 towards someone who committed a heinous offense on the streets.
And they, and people have made him a cult hero. I mean, that's
exactly right.
It's a scary. Well, there's one thing I find interesting that we previously mentioned, that you guys had brought up, something called the attack cycle, which provides a strategic lens for identifying and disrupting planning stages for targeted violence, and then turning that protection from response to prevention. So you guys talk a little bit about the attack cycle as it results to executive protection.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Chuck.
Well, one thing, Steve, I just want to bring up before we go into the attack cycle, and Trinity kind of walks us there, is, if we think about this, I mean, this undertone of eat the rich, kill your CEO, all those things, we could trace this all the way back to the Weather Underground in '69 and Days of Rage.
Sure.
And what was coming out of Vietnam, and this like existential crisis that many Americans felt, not your or Trinity's political discussion here, but I think we see that cycle coming back. And, what was now called the Days of Rage is circulating and bubbling. It's percolated enough to where it's bubbling up again.
And we've got a lot of exacerbating, outside issues that are like you said, facilitating that. I mean, back in the '60s, and you all are too young to remember that. But you didn't have social media. You didn't have polarized different news networks that were streaming that tunnel vision accounts of the worldview that people get in their heads and then use as gospel. So that's tough. But talk a little bit about that attack vector.
Sure. So the attack cycle is really predictable phases that threat actors follow, that have been outlined for us to conduct as protectors, to conduct training on. And some of those things really actually play to our advantage, pre-tech native, society, right?
Right.
Because bad actors had to begin the attack phase, or I'm sorry, the pre-planning phase in the physical space, where they're far more likely to be identified by a trained security driver, or a physical security guy or gal that's standing on post at the corporate headquarters, or a residential security agent. If someone, you keep seeing the same vehicle over and over, or the same person, showing up at the corporate headquarters, or maybe the EA is being contacted by someone posing as a reporter asking probing questions about an event that the CEO is going to appear at. Those types of physical incursions into our space are much easier to pick up than what we're actually dealing with now. And that, I think that kind of allows us to take a step back and say, hey, what are the foundational levels of security? Should it be in the physical space, or does it actually begin in the digital space? I can tell you from my own personal experiences that the vast majority of the physical risk that I was trying to mitigate for actually began in the digital space, because now a bad actor or a threat actor can begin all of that surveillance behind the safety and security of their screen and keyboard in their mom's basement, unfortunately.
Well, think about this, Steve. I mean, Trinity and I have done this many times, and outside of where we are now at 360, I mean, we've both done a lot of consulting and analyzing and risk assessment. And and this could almost be a drinking game if it were a happy hour somewhere, which is you go and there's a principal or protectee and they say, Trinity, there's no problem here. And then Trinity comes to me and I'm the executive assistant and I say, yeah, there's no problem. But there was that one email, or didn't we got that postcard from somebody in the mail, but that's nothing, right? And Trinity's absolutely right. If you think about like target selection and then surveillance and reconnaissance, I mean, what was more resource intensive, dare I say, now has become asymmetric because it makes it easy. Right. I can Google page one, or, Trinity, correct me if I'm wrong, $10 and an information broker, and I can probably find a lot more after I get through Google page one.
Absolutely.
And then my ideation, as we go through the attack cycle, what is that? Target selection, surveillance, planning, prep, and then the actual execution, escape, exploitation. But the further I get in that cycle, the more committed I am to doing something against Steve Lasky. And Trinity's making a great point, which is, look, this low-hanging fruit on the early ends, whatever you can do to obfuscate or delete or take care of those things, the more it maybe prevents me from focusing on Steve Lasky, and maybe I go somewhere else, God forbid, or I just, I just do something else, because all of a sudden it's just harder for me to get there. And, perhaps technology has somewhat made me lazy in my efforts because it's easy to just sit here and Google and I don't need to go to the courthouse or do a lot of physical stuff.
This sort of segues into, this discussion where, you always have organizations, upper management, whether you're in risk or security, having people warning for, you're looking for red flags, you're looking for early warning signals, you're figuring out how to use open source intelligence, threat monitoring tools, social, psychological profiling, all the things that you guys do as a company too. So what are the key indicators, whether it's social, political, behavioral, that should trigger proactive protective measures for executives or lawmakers? And how can organizations effectively monitor these without violating privacy and without creating a bunker mentality within the organization?
Hey, Steve, there was one last thing that I wanted to touch on.
Sure. No, go ahead.
On the last question, I think is very important, because digital executive protection is not the only thing that you should be doing as an executive, or actually as anyone trying to protect their privacy. And what I mean by that is, yes, getting your information off of data broker websites, people search sites, is imperative. How about also placing your home in a layered trust and ensuring that you're not listed as a beneficiary or as an executive on that trust? If in fact you have been impacted by some sort of stalking, cyber stalking, in-person stalking, digital harassment, something of the nature. I think right now about 35 states actually have legislation in place. In California, they call it the Safe at Home Act. It was originally designed to help battered folks escape an abusive relationship, and the government actually issues you an address that can be utilized for voting, your driver's license, etc. So there are varying means and measures that should be taken to ensure that you're taking a proactive step to protect your privacy and your safety as well, so that it's not just as simple as typing in a few keywords on a Google search bar or a Yahoo search bar to get to that information, if that's fair.
So Chuck, bringing me back to my question.
Steve. So there's the traditional means, like, hey, did Steve receive a letter? Did Steve get an email? Is, like in Trinity said, did so and so show up and they want to talk to Steve or something? But now I think as we've kind of moved into this, we've moved into a more social media fueled space where information is now the new oil and the narrative is probably the new money. I mean, we also have to, I think, monitor for narrative escalation, not just the threats that come in. I mean, you can say, look, Steve Lasky assassination, Steve Lasky murder. That might come up with some things, but we also have to understand there's, again, I purposely used the word hallucination. What is the hallucination around Steve Lasky? What is the narrative around him? What is the narrative around his organization? What is, and then there's a pattern that comes around that, and we have to monitor against the pattern, as well as mapping symbolic relevance, not just your role. Like people, I mean, one might say, Steve, you might say, like, hey, I'm not that big deal. I'm not a huge cog in the wheel. But as we saw with what was it, Trinity, the Luigi Was Right website, followed immediately by the CEO database. I mean, here is a bunch of information on people in an organization that we've put up there that is all open source driven, gotten from data brokers. And now Steve Lasky appears in the same list as, say, Jeff Bezos or somebody else. And if I'm ideating, I'm like, well, I'm never going to get to Jeff Bezos, but this Lasky guy,
I'll get the low hanging fruit.
Exactly, because I still, what did we see from Luigi? What do we see going all the way back to Weather Underground? What do we see now with these terrible incidents in Minnesota? Is I need to make a statement, because I believe by making a statement, I can act change or get something, some effect. So I think we can no longer just look at the traditional means. I think we really have to open this aperture up and say, I go back to threat informed. What is the environment? What is the threat? That brings me down to the individual things I need to look at, which creates action that I can turn over to Trinity and say, here's what I think the top 5 issues that we need to monitor against are.
So, Trinity, in your opinion, then, what does the Minnesota political assassinations reveal about the modern threat actors that are on the scene today?
So I think it's a combination to Chuck's point that some of it is mental health issues, but I think the vast majority of it is ideologically driven. And to Chuck's point, there's new information coming out daily specifically on that incident, and I don't want to overstep our boundaries because that's very new to the scene. But a lot of these incidents, in my opinion, are also a bit ideologically virtue signaling. So I can say that I enacted this change by doing this act for my cause, which I think is a very dangerous space that we're kind of drifting into here in the United States. We saw it not only with physical violence towards people, but also negative sentiment towards Elon Musk and the firebombing of Tesla dealerships, and en masse social media, folks keying Teslas of folks that had nothing to do with the issue in public spaces. So I think a lot of the issues that we're currently facing are actually driven by ideology, geopolitics, and unfortunately fueled by likes on social media, unfortunately.
Chuck, as one factor I think we need to bring in here is artificial intelligence. I mean, it's a buzzword for everything, so why not bring it into executive protection? As AI accelerates the risk in digital identity reputation by enabling hyper personalized targeting, what's the impact that the AI is going to have on digital identity and reputation in the future, and even making it easier for some of these lone wolves to carry out some of these attacks?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And AI is a great buzzword, just like
Yeah.
convergence was a few years ago
Oh,
and
yeah.
asymmetric was a few years
Yeah.
before that. And I think we're seeing both convergence and asymmetric come to the forefront, perhaps fueled a little bit by AI, tongue in cheek there. I think as I look at it, a couple ways. One, if I look at it as an executive, I say, what is the opportunity in AI? You know, if I'm Chuck Randolph, sole contractor, what's the opportunity for me to upscale my business to my ability to just work better? If I'm a bad actor, I throw an asymmetric. I mean, it allows me and it fuels me to do things that and I'll turn this over to Trini, but it fuels me to be able to do things that, quite honestly, I couldn't do before. But now I can play with the big boys and girls. So it truly is a leveler of, or it levels the playing field for threat actors. And then as I guess the other thing I think about in AI is this idea of like escalating the narrative. You know, things like deep fakes and things like hyperscaling and understanding. If you go to whether it's ChatGPT or Perplexity and say, okay, let's, find something about Trinity. Now tell me about this. Now tell me about that. It just makes it that much easier for me to find and fix on that target going back to that attack cycle. But a lot of this, and Trinity, I'll turn over to you to add what I'm missing here is I think about Kurzweil's law. There's this Kurzweil was a scientist inventor, and he has Kurzweil's law. I'm going to butcher this on a Monday morning, but essentially it talks about the acceleration of technology and the opportunity that comes in that. And I think about that, and we used to talk about Moore's Law because that was the buzzword,
Right.
but I think Kurzweil's Law is something we need to think about because the rate of escalation of technology and advancement, with that, we know with any advancement, the bad guys are going to come in and try to figure out how to use it, whether they need me to contact a Nigerian prince or whether they're trying to find and fix Steve Lasky. And I think what we need to do, and I guess my call to action for security leadership would be we need to get in front of fighting the last battle and stop worrying about titling and silos and all that. And we really need to embrace Kurzweil's law so that we can be agile and fluid within the risk.
Well, Trinity, that is going to bring me to I think the last question we're going to wrap this up with, because that's just perfect. And I want both of you guys to kind of reflect on the systematic gaps that are exposed by these recent attacks. Whether executive protection is too siloed from cybersecurity, or what policies or culture shifts are needed to create a unified and adaptive protective posture that doesn't alienate the public or hinder operational leadership. So the question is, in balancing accessibility and security, what lessons can be drawn from these recent high-profile breaches, and how can corporations and government bodies better coordinate both physical and digital protection strategies in today's hybrid risk environment, which we're in? We're in a hybrid risk environment.
Well, I think the unfortunate reality we see with both Chuck and I working in the corporate space at some point in our career, we've seen that physical security and InfoSec often are siloed off and they kind of stay in their own lanes. The unfortunate reality is threat actors don't stay in a specific lane.
Right.
A lot of the risk that we face really bridges the gap between both of those types of security. And I think, unfortunately, we live in an era where it's incumbent upon us as protectors to extend an olive branch from the physical side over to the InfoSec side, or vice versa, and say, hey, we have to work in a collaborative measure because those types of cross-functional relationships foster faster decision making, fewer blind spots, and, to be quite honest, more resilient operations. Because going back to my previous comment, nearly all of the physical risk that I faced or was trying to mitigate for began in the digital space, whether that is the prevalence of PII on the open web, an exploitable device, access control at the homes, etc. I mean, you have to have a very comprehensive cross-functional program in order to really provide the level of security that the vast majority of the executives that are facing nowadays. Chuck, did you have anything to add there?
So I guess the only thing I'd add to that, because that's well done and succinct, Trinity. I'd say, like Steve, and I look, I'm talking to the choir. Everyone watching, listening, or on this call are probably on this bandwagon already. Adversaries aren't waiting for policy coordination. They're not waiting for us to decide if my red level 5 is your 1A. They're not waiting to say, my advanced persistent threat 34 is your Stellinium or whatever it is. They're just doing. They are. And they're not waiting to coordinate across the digital or physical. So if we continue to treat things like cyber, EP, physical security, and brand integrity as separate disciplines, we're losing right off the bat. I mean, we're losing before we even get to square one. But I think, Steve, as the adversaries just are, the threat cycle it's converged. I mean, I really think we need to get to a point to where we have common operating information, which means a common threat picture, which is going to get us to common operating language. Are we talking about the things in the same way, in such that we can? Cyber needs to understand the physical side, as Trinity said. And if you're EP, if you're an EP executive protection person, you really need to have a working knowledge of a lot of things, because you're there to protect principals, likely someone who's a high value target. So you need to know fully across the board what the threats are, and fully across the board what the fixes are. And then, it all starts with just conversations. I mean, if we could do one thing right now, you're in an organization, I'd say pick up the phone, pick up an email, Slack, whatever you're doing, and say, let's have a working group once a month. I'll buy the coffee, and let's just talk about the risks.
Guys, wonderful discussion. We probably could have gone on at least another hour or so. And but again, it's just so interesting to see how different EP is now, considering the threat vectors and how they've changed, and how we're looking at both cyber and physical security as part of the EP picture, which a decade ago was not even something we considered. So just really a fascinating conversation. So Chuck Randolph, Trinity Davis from 360 Privacy. I'm sure we'll have you guys back again, and look forward to it. But until we do, everybody have a great week. And Sam, I'm going to let you take us away.
Well, Steve, thank you, Chuck, and Trinity for this compelling conversation about the domestic threats facing today's corporate and political leaders, as well as how organizations can assess and mitigate these expanding risks. And thank you for tuning in. This podcast is your go-to source for staying ahead in the security industry. It offers sharp insights, real-time trends, and straight talk for industry professionals. It's built to keep you informed and empowered wherever you are. Stay connected, stay sharp, and maintain security at the forefront. To access our podcast lineup, go to podbean.com and search for Security DNA. You can also find our podcasts on our Security Frontline, Integrator Newswire, and Security Week e-newsletters. Of course, we'd love to receive feedback from you, our listeners, about topics that interest you. If you have a suggestion, email us at steve@SecurityInfoWatch.com. This episode of the Security DNA podcast was recorded and produced by Samantha Schober, that's me, assistant editor for Security InfoWatch. For Steve Lasky, Chuck Randolph, Trinity Davis, and everyone at Security InfoWatch, thank you for listening, and keep an ear open for our next podcast.